In the beginning, it did not seem unusual. A few coughs here, a slight fever there. In early 1918, the world was still wrapped in the long shadow of the First World War. Soldiers marched and drilled, telegrams clicked their way across oceans, and people in small towns across the United States rose each day to the steady rhythm of life. Milking cows, sweeping porches, waiting for trains that ran just slightly behind schedule. It was in this calm, measured world, a world that had grown used to the idea of distant death, that a new illness began to circulate. The first cases may have gone unnoticed, or perhaps simply unremarked. A sore throat, a headache, maybe a strange sort of fatigue. It was the kind of thing that, in a world before antibiotics and virology, might have passed for a late winter cold. But by March of 1918, something peculiar was taking place at Camp Funston, part of the sprawling Fort Riley military installation in Kansas. Hundreds of soldiers began to report sick within days. Fevers ran high. Noses bled. Some turned blue around the lips. And still, many recovered. At first, doctors weren't sure what to call it. They suspected influenza, the grip, as it was often called, but it didn't quite fit. For one, it moved fast. An entire barracks could fall ill overnight. And it wasn't just the frail or elderly who were suffering. Healthy young men, the kind who passed military physicals, were being laid up in cots, their breath short and their skin hot and dry. By April, cases had spread to other military camps. Soldiers, many of them now packed onto troop trains or steaming eastward on ships bound for Europe, carried the illness with them. And still, it remained a curiosity rather than a crisis. No alarms were raised. The press, wary of alarming the public or disrupting wartime morale, reported little. What news there was came from neutral countries, particularly Spain, where the king himself had fallen ill. Hence the name Spanish flu, though Spain had nothing to do with its origin. In truth, the virus likely began in the American Midwest, moving slowly at first, then accelerating with every passing train and every close-packed group of people. By early summer, the disease had reached cities on both coasts. Yet the summer wave was, by most accounts, mild. People got sick, but they recovered. The death toll was not yet startling. Life went on. And so, the flu settled quietly into the fabric of American life. In the towns of Illinois and Ohio, in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, in the crowded tenements of New York City, and the dusty streets of El Paso, people carried on. There were groceries to fetch, coal to shovel, letters to write. The war effort absorbed much of the country's attention. Liberty bonds were being sold, men were being drafted, and in the quiet corners of the country, behind counters, in barns, along neighborhood sidewalks, people coughed, wiped their brows, and went to bed early, thinking they might simply need a good rest. Doctors were not idle, but they were limited. There were no viral tests, no vaccines, no antibiotics for secondary infections. The average physician in 1918 traveled by foot, horse, or Ford Model T. He might carry a leather bag filled with gauze, a stethoscope, quinine, and a thermos of broth. In small towns, families might still call for the midwife, the apothecary, or the elderly neighbor who knew a thing or two about herbs. In the quiet rhythm of those days, news traveled slowly. A postcard might take 2 days to arrive. A newspaper might not mention illness at all. And so, many did not know that the same fever troubling their household had already reached army camps in Georgia and lumber towns in Oregon. A cough here, a cough there. A boy in the next county down with the grip. It was familiar, or it seemed to be. By late August, something changed. In Boston, sailors from a returning ship brought something home with them. Within days, the city's Commonwealth Pier was crowded with sick men, and they were sicker than before. Fevers came quickly. Pneumonia followed. Some died within days. Hospitals began to fill. Nurses, many of them volunteers, were summoned. And this time, it did not stop. The flu spread outward from Boston like ripples on a pond, into the city proper, then into surrounding towns, then to New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. The trains ran on time. So did the illness. In homes and boarding houses, people began to whisper about it. The baker's daughter, the tailor's assistant, the postman who hadn't been by in 3 days. Entire families were falling ill. The newspapers began to take cautious notice, not of panic, that would not do in wartime, but of an unusual outbreak, a nervous fever, or this strange new influenza. In Philadelphia, there was talk of canceling public events. But the Liberty Loan Parade, a grand procession of patriotism and fundraising, went ahead. It would become a tragic turning. By October of 1918, the illness had a shape, a smell, a weight. It moved differently now, no longer a distant murmur, no longer a column in the back of the newspaper. It had settled into every city block, every row house, every rural outpost. It was now something people whispered about behind doors that never quite closed. America, by then, was a nation at war and a nation in bed. Hospitals filled quickly. Beds spilled into hallways. Classrooms were converted into wards. Armories, dance halls, and auditoriums were turned into temporary shelters for the sick. In Philadelphia, some hospitals reported over 100 new cases every hour. The city's morgue overflowed. Carts rolled down the cobbled streets each morning, collecting bodies. Wooden coffins stacked in church basements. There were not enough undertakers, not enough grave diggers. In some places, mass graves were dug, quietly, with shovels and little ceremony. Doctors wore gauze masks and kept notebooks. They wrote of lungs that filled with fluid, skin that turned dusky or blue. People who died not in weeks or days, but in mere hours. The virus moved quickly and aggressively. Many victims were young adults, the healthy, the strong, the recently conscripted. It was the reverse of what people expected. Children and the elderly were still at risk, of course, but it was the young who fell hardest this time. Philadelphia was not alone. In Boston, Baltimore, St. Louis, and New York, the story was the same. There were not enough nurses, not enough medicines. Families closed their homes. People stayed indoors. The streets, once busy with war rallies and factory whistles, grew quieter. In homes across the country, sick rooms appeared. The sick were laid in parlors, attics, cellars. Spare rooms were turned into isolation quarters. Curtains were drawn. Newspapers were read aloud in low voices. Spoons clinked against cups of broth. Mothers dabbed foreheads with damp cloths. Fathers took to reading almanacs or rearranging kitchen chairs, finding quiet tasks in quiet houses. The remedies were familiar and often futile. Onion poultices wrapped around the chest. Mustard plasters spread on the back. Goose grease rubbed into the soles of feet, with wool socks pulled up tight. Some slept with sliced onions in bowls beside the bed. Others burned sulfur in the corners of rooms. One popular idea was to breathe deeply through a salt-soaked handkerchief. Doctors prescribed rest and fresh air, which meant windows stayed open even as temperatures dropped. Families layered the sick in quilts and coats. In some homes, an extra pot of coffee was kept warm on the stove not for comfort, but to mask the smell of illness. The air grew heavy with Vicks, camphor, and boiled vinegar. Outside, cities took slow, uneven action. In New York, theaters were ordered to close early, but not entirely. In St. Louis, officials limited crowding on streetcars. In Chicago, saloons stayed open, but bartenders were told not to serve anyone who appeared ill. In Atlanta, churches were asked to remain closed for 2 weeks. Most did. Some didn't. Masks became common. Thin gauze squares, often homemade, held in place with string or elastic. Posters went up, "Wear a mask and save your life." In San Francisco, an ordinance made mask-wearing mandatory. Violators could be fined or even arrested. A man who sneezed on a streetcar without a mask was removed by police. There was grumbling, of course. Not everyone agreed, but most complied, slowly, quietly, obediently, as the case counts rose. Mail still arrived. The postman might wear gloves, might pause a little longer at the gate, might knock instead of using the bell. Newspapers were still printed. Milk was still delivered. The wheels of everyday life turned, just a little slower. In many cities, schools closed. Students were told to study at home. Some districts mailed lessons in envelopes. Others sent teachers door to door. A child might receive an arithmetic worksheet from one hand, then a spoonful of cough syrup from another. Many children spent those weeks in bed, not from schoolwork, but from the flu itself. There was no national coordination. Every town had its own rules. Some had none at all. One day, a mayor might declare it safe to return to work. The next, he might fall ill himself. Public health departments issued circulars with instructions. Do not spit on the sidewalk. Do not shake hands. Avoid crowd. Air out your rooms. Boil your handkerchiefs. These were repeated like prayers. Funerals were limited in size. Sometimes they were held outdoors. Sometimes not at all. Families placed wreaths on doors, posted notices in windows, waited for the telegrams that now carried more sorrow than news. Bells tolled, clocks ticked. Radios buzzed faintly in the corner, though most homes still did not own one. Word of mouth was still how most people learned what was happening. In the country, the flu came more slowly, but when it arrived, it